John Miller, a successful engineer in Houston, Texas, was living a peaceful life with his young daughter Emily after his wife, Linda, had died in a mysterious car accident a few years ago. Following Linda's death, John poured all his attention into Emily and his work, but loneliness still surrounded him. To help care for Emily and manage household affairs, John hired Sarah Thompson, a woman in her 30s, as a housekeeper. Sarah quickly earned John's trust and became an indispensable part of their home. However, gradually, the relationship between John and Sarah shifted from simple affection to an illicit affair. They kept their relationship hidden, unaware that a shadow from John's past was watching their every move. Linda was still alive and silently observing from afar. After Linda's fake death, John faced many challenges raising his daughter alone. His marriage to Linda had already experienced cracks, mainly because Linda felt stifled in her role as a wife and mother. She staged a car accident and vanished from John's life without leaving a trace. John believed Linda was dead and accepted this loss, unaware that she had planned her escape to free herself from an unhappy marriage. After Linda's departure, John focused on work to fill the emptiness. Emily, still very young at the time, didn't fully understand what had happened to her mother. She only knew that her father had changed, becoming distant and smiling less. John tried to maintain a normal life for Emily, but everything became too much for him. That's when Sarah Thompson came into the picture. Sarah had a difficult past, filled with financial troubles and complex relationships. When John hired her as a housekeeper, Sarah saw it as an opportunity to stabilize her life. At first, she worked diligently and became a vital support for John in taking care of Emily. Sarah also quickly won the little girl's heart, creating a warm and comfortable environment for the father and daughter. The relationship between John and Sarah slowly became closer. They often talked about work, family, and gradually realized they had much in common. One night, after a long conversation about their lonely lives, they couldn't hold back their emotions and began an affair. John knew it was wrong, but he felt drawn to Sarah's allure, while Sarah saw John as a chance to escape her unstable past. While John and Sarah were immersed in their secret affair, Linda, who had faked her death, was still watching from afar. After disappearing, she had lived anonymously in another city but couldn't resist the urge to know how her ex-husband and daughter were doing. Linda hired a detective to follow John and learned every detail about his life. She discovered the relationship between John and Sarah, and it enraged her. Though Linda had no intention of returning, upon learning that her ex-husband had moved on and found a new love, she felt betrayed and decided to return to confront them. The relationship between John and Sarah became increasingly difficult to manage. Although they tried to conceal their affair, the tension in John's home started to show. John felt torn between his feelings for Sarah and his responsibilities as a father. Whenever he looked into Emily's eyes, he felt guilty, fearing that his daughter would discover their relationship. Sarah, too, was consumed by insecurity. She knew that if the truth were revealed, not only would her relationship with John fall apart, but she might lose her chance at a stable life. Their secret encounters grew more tense as anxiety surrounded both of them. John, who had always controlled everything in his work and life, now felt things slipping out of his grasp. Sarah, on the other hand, tried to maintain a calm exterior, but inside was constantly fearful that her past would be exposed. Everything reached a breaking point when John received an anonymous message, threatening to expose his relationship with Sarah. This message sent John into a panic, suspecting that someone was watching him. His anxiety grew when private details about his and Sarah's lives seemed impossible to keep hidden any longer. At first, he thought it might be a coworker or a neighbor who had found out, but John's worst fear soon became a reality. Linda, the wife he thought had died, suddenly appeared at his doorstep one evening. John was stunned to see Linda, the woman he believed had been lost in a tragic accident years earlier, now return, like a ghost from his past. Linda hadn't just come back. She knew everything about his relationship with Sarah. She had been watching from afar, and when she learned about John's new life, her fury grew, driving her to return and confront her ex-husband and the woman he was involved with. The first confrontation between John, Sarah, and Linda was an intense psychological battle. Linda, with her cold and patient demeanor, began playing a cat-and-mouse game with John and Sarah, driving both of them into panic. She didn't rush to expose the truth, but gradually increased psychological pressure on them. Linda made veiled threats, implying that she could reveal the truth at any moment, completely destroying the new life John and Sarah had tried to build. Sarah, already living in anxiety, now became desperate when she realized Linda not only knew about her relationship with John, but also held secrets about her past. Linda had sensitive information about Sarah that could ruin everything for her. Sarah felt cornered, unsure of how to maintain her place in John's life. John, on the other hand, was both terrified and enraged by Linda's unexpected return. He couldn't understand why she had staged her death and was now back to destroy his life. The emotions he had suppressed over the years exploded into loud arguments between him and Linda. Meanwhile, Sarah became more unstable than ever, caught between siding with John or protecting herself. In John's small house, the tension escalated day by day. Though young, Emily could sense the changes in the family atmosphere. She overheard arguments between her father and Sarah, as well as cryptic conversations between them and Linda. While Emily couldn't fully understand what was happening, she felt an unnamed threat looming over her family. Secrets slowly unraveled, and the family tension escalated into an unavoidable tragedy. Linda, with her goal of revenge, wasn't afraid to use every tactic to make John and Sarah pay for what they had done. That fateful night, the atmosphere in John's house became heavy as Linda walked in, facing her ex-husband and Sarah. The long-awaited confrontation had arrived. Linda, with icy calmness, sat down across from John and Sarah in the living room. She was no longer the vulnerable woman from years ago. Now, Linda appeared as a strong woman, determined to reclaim everything she had lost. John felt his heart pounding, filled with worry and fear about what would happen. Sarah, sitting next to him, was overwhelmed by the pressure. Linda began the confrontation by recounting in detail how she had followed their lives. She had known about John and Sarah's relationship for a long time and had planned her return. When the time was right, she didn't just take my man, she stole the life I had built, Linda said, her sharp eyes fixed on Sarah. Sarah tried to remain calm, but inside, she was collapsing. Linda continued to make it clear that she didn't just want to expose their illicit relationship, but also destroy their lives. I've watched from afar long enough, Linda whispered, her voice full of control. Now it's time for you to pay. John tried to de-escalate the situation, pleading with Linda to let it go. But his words only fueled her anger. Linda threatened to meet with a lawyer, reveal everything to the media, and destroy John's career. She also wasn't afraid to use Emily, their daughter, as a tool in her revenge. This drove John into a furious outburst. It seemed everything was slipping out of John and Sarah's control. But what made matters worse was that Linda wasn't just making verbal threats. She had gathered evidence of their relationship, from secret messages to covert photos of them together. She had everything ready to present in court and destroy the life John and Sarah had been trying to protect. In a panic, John tried to wrestle with Linda, demanding that she stop. But the situation had escalated beyond repair. Sarah, terrified, rushed to intervene in the heated argument. In the chaos, Linda fell and hit her head on the corner of the table. She lay unconscious, blood beginning to pool from the wound on her head. John and Sarah were both stunned by what had just happened, unable to believe the situation had escalated to this point. Linda lay motionless on the floor, and neither John nor Sarah knew if she was still alive or already dead. Panic set in, and they began to realize that everything had spiraled out of control. From here, The real tragedy began as they were forced to face the consequences of their wrong actions. After that chaotic moment, the room fell eerily silent. Linda lay motionless on the floor, blood from the wound on her head forming a small puddle on the ground. John stood frozen, breathing heavily while Sarah retreated to the corner of the room, her hands covering her face, completely shocked by what had just transpired. Neither of them could believe that the situation had escalated to this level. John was the first to break the silence, trying to check if Linda was still alive. He knelt beside her, but couldn't detect any breath or sign of life. Panic washed over him as he realized that Linda might be dead. Everything in his mind became a blur. He had gone from living a seemingly peaceful life to now standing in front of an unimaginable tragedy. Sarah, in a state of shock, screamed, "What do we do now?" Both of them realized that this situation could lead to them being charged with murder. In their minds, everything began to turn into a desperate plan to cover up the truth. They knew they couldn't let anyone discover what had happened, as John's career would collapse, and Sarah would lose her chance at a new life. Still panicking, John decided they needed to hide Linda's body. He thought that if they could erase all traces, the police wouldn't suspect that she had ever returned. They began taking desperate actions to hide their crime. John and Sarah moved Linda's body down to the basement, cleaning up the scene, trying to wipe away all traces of the altercation. Meanwhile, Emily, John's little daughter, had heard the loud noises from her room and quietly came downstairs to check. She witnessed her father and Sarah cleaning up around her mother's body, though she didn't fully understand what was happening. But this left a terrifying mark on Emily's mind. She quietly retreated, too scared to ask anything, returning to her room, confused and afraid. John and Sarah continued cleaning up the scene throughout the night. They scrubbed away the blood, removed any evidence that could make the police suspicious, hoping that hiding the body would prevent any investigation. However, guilt began to consume them both. John constantly thought about what had happened, unable to accept that he had let his life lead to such a terrible tragedy. Sarah, though trying to stay calm, couldn't stop trembling as she thought about the consequences. But no matter how hard they tried, the truth couldn't stay hidden forever. As the new day began, the haunting reality of what they had done couldn't be erased. John and Sarah had to face the grim truth that, whether or not they successfully concealed the crime, they were now prisoners of their own guilt. The tragedy had occurred, and nothing could erase its mark. Although John and Sarah had tried to hide Linda's body and erase all traces of the altercation, her sudden disappearance couldn't escape the attention of those around them. Friends and acquaintances of Linda began to question her sudden return, and then her unexplained disappearance. A few days later, the police began investigating her disappearance, starting by interrogating John, the last person to have seen her. Houston police soon uncovered inconsistencies in John's story. John claimed that Linda had shown up at the house unexpectedly and, after a brief argument, left without returning. But the details in John's account didn't match those given by neighbors, who had heard loud arguing that night. The pressure on John and Sarah began to mount as the police expanded their investigation. Sarah, who had been anxious before, could no longer maintain her composure when questioned by the police. Under the pressure from investigators, she kept changing details in her story, making them suspect that she was hiding something. Sarah's fingerprints, left on objects connected to Linda, began to make the police suspect that Sarah was involved in Linda's death. What pushed the tragedy to its climax was the unexpected testimony of Emily, John's young daughter. Emily, in her fear and trauma, could no longer remain silent. She revealed that she had seen her father and Sarah cleaning up around her mother's body that night. While Emily's account wasn't entirely clear, it was the key that led the police to return to John's house for a more thorough investigation. When the police conducted a more detailed search of the house, they found traces that John and Sarah hadn't been able to completely erase. Ultimately, Linda's body was discovered in the basement. This evidence immediately shifted the investigation from a missing person case to a murder case. John and Sarah now had nowhere left to run. Their tragedy had reached its peak, and they had to face the terrible consequences of their wrong actions. The official investigation into Linda's death began when police discovered her body in John's basement. Houston police immediately cordoned off the scene, bringing in a forensic team to collect evidence. This marked the shift from a missing person case to a murder case. Tremendous pressure began to bear down on John and Sarah as they realized their time was up. Detective James Roberts, a seasoned investigator with years of experience handling family cases, was assigned to lead the investigation. When he began interrogating John, Roberts immediately noticed the inconsistencies. John's story had too many holes, and the tension in his voice only added to the suspicion. John tried to stick to his story that Linda had unexpectedly returned, and then left after an argument. But the details of her timing and actions didn't match the evidence at the scene. Meanwhile, Sarah was interrogated separately. She could no longer maintain her previous composure. Under the weight of mounting evidence, Sarah began to panic. She kept changing her testimony and couldn't provide a consistent story. Detective Roberts quickly realized that Sarah was hiding something and kept pressing on the inconsistencies in her testimony. This only deepened the police's suspicion that Sarah might have played a significant role in Linda's death. Forensic experts conducted an autopsy on Linda and discovered that she had been assaulted before falling. The wounds on her head weren't the result of a simple accident, but rather a struggle. Furthermore, Sarah's fingerprints were found on Linda's neck, further implicating her in the altercation before Linda died. This directly contradicted the story that both John and Sarah had provided. When the police revisited Emily's testimony, the situation became clearer. Emily had witnessed part of the incident that night, but out of fear, she had stayed silent. In a conversation with a child psychologist, Emily recounted that she had seen her father and Sarah cleaning up around her mother's body. She also remembered her father telling her not to tell anyone about what had happened. Based on Emily's testimony, the police began focusing on how John and Sarah had tried to cover up the crime. Their message history and phone calls on the night of the incident were retrieved, revealing that they had discussed how to handle the body and clean up the scene. Evidence from their phones showed their panic and desperation as they tried to cover up the truth. In addition, forensic experts found traces of blood that hadn't been completely cleaned from the floor, and evidence of a struggle stretching from the living room to the basement. Blood samples from both John and Sarah were found near Linda's body, confirming that they were both present when Linda died. Detective Roberts didn't just focus on John and Sarah's testimonies, but also delved into Sarah's past. They uncovered that Sarah had been involved in several financial disputes and had a complicated history with romantic relationships. This suggested a possible motive for her wanting to maintain her relationship with John to secure a more stable life. The police began to suspect that Sarah might have deliberately incited the conflict with Linda to eliminate her and keep John for herself. However, the final, most damning evidence came from a handwritten letter Linda had left in John's study. In the letter, Linda wrote about her return to confront John and Sarah, revealing that she knew about their illicit relationship. The letter was filled with Linda's anger and determination to reclaim her place in John's life and their daughter's life. With undeniable evidence, fingerprints, bloodstains, Emily's testimony, and Linda's final letter, the police concluded that Linda had been killed during a confrontation. Both John and Sarah were charged with murder. They not only faced legal conviction, but also had to endure the emotional collapse that came with realizing that this tragedy was the direct consequence of their selfish choices. The trial of John Miller and Sarah Thompson quickly became a focal point of public attention, not only because of the tragic nature of the case, but also due to the surprise return of Linda, the wife who was believed to have died. The media widely covered the event, turning it into one of Houston's most high-profile trials in recent years. The prosecutor opened the trial by presenting the overwhelming evidence against John and Sarah. They focused on Sarah's fingerprints found on Linda's neck, the bloodstains at the scene, and especially the crucial testimony of Emily, John's daughter. The prosecutor argued that John and Sarah had deliberately staged the crime, hiding Linda's death to continue their affair without facing the consequences. In the defense's opening statements, John's lawyer tried to frame the incident as an unfortunate accident. They argued that Linda's sudden return had created a severe psychological shock for both John and Sarah, and her death was merely the result of an unintended struggle. John's lawyer also emphasized that John had no motive to kill his wife, as he had accepted his new life and cared for Emily for years. Sarah's lawyer, meanwhile, attempted to argue that Sarah wasn't the mastermind behind the crime, but was merely a victim, caught up in the conflict between John and Linda. Sarah claimed she acted in self-defense when Linda attacked her first in a fit of anger. Sarah even asserted that she had no knowledge that Linda was still alive before her unexpected return, adding to the mental strain she had endured throughout the affair. The most emotional point of the trial came when Emily, John's young daughter, was called to the stand. With the support of a child psychologist, Emily recounted what she had witnessed on the night of the incident. Her testimony added to the complexity and heartbreak of the case. As the child was drawn into the tragedy of her parents, Emily not only described seeing her father and Sarah cleaning up the scene, but also detailed her fear and loneliness at having to keep silent about what she had seen. The prosecutor used Emily's testimony to reinforce their argument that John and Sarah had intentionally concealed the crime, turning the case from an accidental death into a planned cover-up. Finally, after days of deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. John Miller was found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Sarah Thompson, though not directly charged with Linda's murder, was convicted as an accomplice and sentenced to 15 years in prison. The court determined that while Sarah wasn't the one who caused Linda's death, she had actively participated in concealing the crime and had intentionally misled the investigation. The trial concluded, leaving a heavy aftermath. This wasn't just the end of a family tragedy, but a stark warning about the painful consequences of deceit and selfishness in relationships. After the jury's verdict, John Miller was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for second-degree murder. The downfall of a once successful and exemplary man left many shocked. John had not only lost his career and freedom, but also his relationship with his daughter, Emily. His sentence was the price he had to pay for his great mistakes and the affair that led to Linda's death. Sarah Thompson, although not the one who directly caused Linda's death, was sentenced to 15 years in prison for her complicity and participation in covering up the crime. Her days behind bars would be filled with haunting regret, knowing that she had become part of this tragic affair. The dream of a stable life she had hoped for when entering a relationship with John was now shattered, replaced by imprisonment and the heavy price of her wrong choices. Emily, the innocent child, had to bear the emotional scars that could never heal. She had not only lost her mother but had also witnessed her father being convicted. She was sent to live with distant relatives, and the memory of this murder would forever remain a mental scar that Emily would carry throughout her life. The trial's conclusion marked the end of the case, but its echoes left valuable lessons about the catastrophic consequences of deceit, betrayal, and the unthinkable price it can exact. The family tragedy of John and Sarah ended not only with legal punishment, but also with emotional ruin and irreversible loss. John Miller's family tragedy serves as a powerful reminder of the disastrous consequences of wrong decisions, lies, and betrayal. John, once a responsible father, lost everything because of an affair. Sarah, a woman who once hoped for a better life, now faces years behind bars. Linda, the ultimate victim, paid with her life when she returned to confront her past. However, the one who suffered the most was Emily, a little girl who had to grow up with the pain of losing both her parents and the trauma of witnessing a family torn apart. This story is a cautionary tale about responsibility, loyalty, and the importance of truth in every relationship.